Hello, everyone, and welcome to another live conversation on Let's Talk Leadership. Certainly on a gloriously sunny but cold day in the United Kingdom. Joining us today, we have Phil Donnison, one of our colleagues and friends, who's an executive coach and facilitator, and Tim, that you've met before, who is joining us from Germany. So welcome to both of you. And what we thought we'd do this morning is continue a conversation that we'd started a couple of weeks ago. And we got into some fairly deep conversations around psychometrics. So we thought we'd just step back a bit and widen that conversation and maybe just take it away from describing psychometrics specifically that people might not have heard of and look more about the behaviors that sometimes these sort of assessments can help us see and view and understand the impact on others. So join in the conversation. By all means, get on the chat, ask any questions as normal. They'll come up on the screen below us, and we'll do our best to answer them. So I'm going to throw it open to Phil, first of all, to kick us off. So Phil, you offered to start the conversation. So over to you.
So psychometrics, yes. So do you love them? Do you hate them? I think that this whole area is often very contentious and forgets a few things which are basics about it. So psychometrics, personality tests, the idea that there's a questionnaire that you fill in that produces a report which gives you a reflection, a mirror to describe your personality. What often gets forgotten in the midst of this is these are essentially self-report questionnaires. You can't measure personality by sort of getting to it, unpacking everything and going to the root in the way you can measure feet and inches, centimeters and meters. You have to ask somebody to report out on this. And so it uses very sophisticated, well worked out questions, or items as they are called, to ask people to report on aspects of their personality, their self-perception, and then looks at it just to standardize it, often comparing it with others, to make sure that it's valid and reliable, using some concerns like, does it change from time to time? And then probably the most useful part of it is it categorizes it into some words, some language, which helps people then discuss it between them. And this is often the most useful part of it, because it's in a branch of psychology which is called individual differences. And so there's nothing better than having some language given to us or some words given to us to be able to talk about the differences between us as individuals. For me, this is the best value for the whole thing. But I think it does get lost quite often in this idea that it is scientific, standardized, reliable, but essentially a self-report measure that people are filling in. Tim, I know you've completed again some recently. I
have. I completed one, which is called Workplace Big Five, after 10 years of having not done it, and it hadn't changed at all. But I do also like to think about the mood that you're in when you're actually filling in the questionnaire. In other words, not just the mood, but the mindset really that you're in when you're filling in the questionnaire. Now, obviously, I wouldn't necessarily say I'm a specialist in this area, but I mean, I work with it a lot, undoubtedly, and I've worked with thousands of participants like the rest of us on the call who've done various psychometrics. And, I like to think that I've got an awareness as I answer those questions of what the question is about and an awareness about myself. So I think one of the key things that you always have to think of when you're filling in a self-report that Phil was describing is someone the kind of person who's very self-aware and in touch with their deeper self. Are they at the other end of the scale kind of filling it in an aspirational way, the way that they would like to be, or the way that they've been told they should be more of, or something like that? Or is it somewhere in the middle, which is kind of a bit of a mixture of home life and work life? Now, obviously, doing the job that I do, I think I was more in the first category. So there was certainly, let's say, a lot of consistency in my answers with 10 years ago. So that's one thing. However, I did do another psychometric, which is more dynamic, which I think you guys mentioned the last time, the FIRO-B, which is more around interpersonal needs. It's more about how we relate to the outside world, what we put into the world and what we want back. And that had changed, and we had a very interesting conversation around that based on what's happened in the last year with COVID, how our needs of what we want back from the world has shifted. And most of us want more coming to us from the outside world than we're putting into the world. That was a shift. But those two things I did are fundamentally measuring different things. That's the whole point. But they're both self-reports. Interesting.
And Tim, you've mentioned, that you did the Workplace Big Five 10 years ago.
Yes.
I don't know when you did the FIRO-B last, but I often get asked questions like, well, over time, do these things change? If I took it every 6 months, would it be different? If I take it every 5 years, would it be different? I just wondered what our collective views are on how we answer that question. Because it's almost as though some of the people asking the question are sort of desperately trying to find another part of their personality that's going to pop up. And sometimes feel a bit upset that, the response is, well, it might or it might not. Some things do, some things don't. I just wondered how the rest of us dealt with that question.
Well, without diving down a nature-nurture debate, so I filled this questionnaire in twice and it hasn't changed, so I must have been born with this.
Yes.
I think that it's quite easy to see it as being something which is fixed, or it's quite easy to go in the opposite direction and say, well, it's a behavior and just describe my behavior so I can change that. But both of the assumptions behind those two opposite statements have a lot of ideas behind them and assumptions that are important. And Tim, you already alluded to one, which is it does depend on the mood you're in when you complete this. We know that, and for a long time, the controlled conditions for filling in a questionnaire were very strict because they were known to alter the questionnaire. All good scientists, even social scientists, know you can affect the thing you're studying by looking at it. So biologists know that if you look at a plant, you change the temperature and breathe on it, and that changes the nature of what you're looking at. And so these things are alterable. They do change over time, but they are stable in many ways, stable in the sense that they don't change over time. And then statistically, you can unpack that and check that. But we do tend to lead to the far end of this, which is the bit of I'm born like this, I can't change, or it is very easy to change this.
Yeah, I mean, I know I often get into conversations and I have to sort of say things like, well, this is the classic argument between psychologists with different sort of views that, you can endlessly talk about nurture or nature, but does it actually help the person, the person that we're actually talking to or working with? I suppose I know there is the sort of the classic viewpoint that there are certain things that happen in our lives that will have a big impact on us, could have a big impact on the way our results of any of these sort of self scores might change over time. And obviously with the pandemic, the point that you made, Tim, that's interesting, perhaps that's something, it's a major event, how that plays out in terms of the way we might see ourselves in the future if we were to use one of these reports to do analysis.
I think it's just one other aspect that's quite interesting, that even if someone takes a psychometric, they come back to us as leadership professionals and say, I don't recognize myself at all in there. There is one very powerful question, isn't there? So tell me what your scores are. Tell me who you are then. I mean, just use the same framework and tell me about yourself. And that sometimes can be enough. Of course, it's not going to, in some ways, help the credibility of the instrument with that particular person. But once the conversation moves on, you're in a good place, and you can go to the behavioral level and say, okay, tell me how this shows up in the workplace then. How does it show up with your direct reports when you try to influence your boss or whatever? So that's another element of the whole reliability validity argument. I think Brit wanted to jump in there.
No, but I can. It's interesting what you said about the showing up in the workplace, because I think that is ultimately what a lot of people are interested in. And if we take the combination that we hear very often, that at least I hear very often when I work with people, it seems to be that a lot of people are now aware of that some people are have an introverted preference and other people have an extroverted preference. So introverts, as we sometimes say, they need to think before they speak, they need to reflect before they speak, whereas extroverted people use their energy or get more energy from interacting with other people, which then sometimes gives them ideas. So they don't need to come to a conversation with a fully reflected state of mind. I was wondering if we could maybe just take a step back and look at some of the other behaviors that can show up in the workplace or in private, really. One of them that I can think of, but feel free to jump in, and I'm just skimming across the different tools because we don't want to go into any one of them in particular, is the preference for either seeing a big picture and sort of possibilities in the future versus people who really like the here and now and who really, really like the details. And I think that is a distinction that I've seen play up in the workplace, and it can cause huge amounts of misunderstanding. But if you can combine the two within a team, it becomes extremely powerful, because obviously, and that's what we also said last time, there is no one good or bad preferred profile. It's all good as long as you can decode it, as it were, in yourself and in other people and work together. So introversion, extroversion, preference for looking at the big picture or preference for looking at smaller details. What else have we got?
Well, before we go to the next one, which I have in mind, I do think it connects with Tim's point about the discussion is the important part of this, because one of the big contributions that I think psychometrics or personality tests have made is just increasing the language, the vocabulary we have around all of this, because we tend in everyday life to sometimes oversimplify it and conflate different ideas. So quite often a detailed focused person might be seen as somebody who sits at their desk, doesn't interact with people a lot and gets down to the details. So introvert, detail focus, we can combine those two, whereas the language with this separates it out to say you can be extrovert and detail focused. You can be introvert and big picture. And we begin to then get away from the sort of the common collections we have around these different descriptions of people's personalities. And so my next one would be, Brit, is this confident and cautious dimension, because that often gets conflated with introversion and extroversion. You can be very confident as an introvert, very cautious as an extrovert, and yet people tend to conflate that into what is effectively social confidence.
I mean, I find all of this fascinating. So I'll try and to pick up on Brit's point. I'll try and give a very specific example. Over time, I think I have become someone who can see a bit more of the wider picture, but I get pulled back all the time into detail, however hard I struggle. So, I mean, to give you one example, there was a time when if someone, say, Phil, you live up in the Lake District in the United Kingdom, if someone had said to me, how do you get to Phil's house? And not even knowing where you live, I would have been able to quote every single street number, road number in the United Kingdom, how long it was going to take to get there, which were the best garages to stop at for the cheapest fuel, you know, and so it goes on. And I remember when we had my wife's 60th birthday party at the house we live in now. It's quite a difficult place to find, even though you can see it, it's quite difficult to get to. I must have written an email about, I don't know, 3 or 4 paragraphs of description for anyone coming from any part of the world to get to our location. And someone just said to me, but all you need to know is once you're in the street, when the footpath runs out, you're basically a house. And so I've gone from sort of writing these massive, great lists to saying, get yourself to, using your sat nav, get yourself to this part of the street. And as soon as the pavement runs out, turn right and you'll find us. And I think, I can imagine working in an environment. I mean, fortunately, I don't have to work too often with lots of other people, otherwise I'd drive them mad. But working in an environment where you've got people who are very, very focused on detail, because that's what they're just good at. And that's what they do, must be sometimes quite challenging if that person is also quite extrovert in the way they react and behave with other people. It might feel a bit overpowering. And likewise, I often wonder how someone who isn't quite so vocal, who's got these lovely big ideas, ever manages to survive in an environment where it's just me sort of doing my detailed stuff all the time. And that's what I find really interesting about a lot of these things, that once you start to see the reality of it and the possible impacts that it might be having, it does at least give you a steer as to, well, maybe I need to do things a little bit differently, and it could be quite fun, or it could be quite interesting, or it might be, well, certainly it might be quite challenging.
Yeah, and I think one of the key things here is it's not either or, as Brit was alluding to. It's often the kind of ranking, in the sense of, where do you go first? Do you first go to details and then see or formulate a bigger picture later? Or are you naturally the kind of person who sees the bigger picture and then might get interested in details as appropriate? I mean, this is often the very simple picture test, isn't it? I mean, I remember once showing a picture of a kind of very nice English Anglo-Saxon church and churchyard in summer to someone and saying, what do you see there? Because we were talking about just this very point. It was someone I knew quite well, because it was someone I worked with. And, she started describing more from a detail point of view than talking about colours or talking about age or what feelings it promoted. And I said, oh, that's interesting. Some people will look at the gravestones first and see the detail and describe it. And she said, actually, I was counting the gravestones, which I thought was quite interesting, rather than talking about, as I say, the weather, the age, the emotions that it did or didn't bring out. I mean, it's also very, very interesting. So it's where you go first. And I think that that's really valuable for leaders when you're having a discussion around customer service, could be anything. Where do you go? Where do your people go? And how do you handle that? How do you make sure that the ranking doesn't matter where people go first, that you can get everything in order as a leader? And that's really what it means, being an inclusive leader there, of course. Not just your own preferences dominating the discussion.
And very helpful with considering not just how I'm doing this myself and do I need to get better at the other thing, and both of them, but also the context in which that happens, because it is, Matthew, your example of how you describing directions has to accommodate the other person's sort of normal way of operating, which is that they may not read all of the words you give them, but things will stick in their mind, like they'll know that they're arriving in your village and they need to look for a path. And so there's in communicating with them in that way, you're considering what they prefer to do and accommodating them. And this is something which in leadership terms is more about how I work with a collection of individuals who are different to each other in order to make sure that they understand me when I communicate with them. And we have that as well as the demands of my job, which is where I may need to focus on particular aspects that don't come easily to me. And if I can describe those in great detail, I can take them from situation to situation. Aspects of my job demand some detail. I used to be able to, so I've often taken groups for a walk in the hills in the Lake District. I need to know how many people there are. I became very good at knowing exactly how many people were in a room, which would not be something, I don't count gravestones or things in that way. And but I learned to, in order to satisfy the demands of my job. Was it something that I'm born able to do, have a preference to do, or not. Eventually, I couldn't tell because it became very practiced and automatic as a result.
Yeah. I mean, I like, one of the things I find is often helpful is that if you, and I try and give you a sort of a work example, if you take one of the assessments we've been talking about, Workplace Big Five, one of the sort of, often they have sort of pairings of words as sort of at each end of the continuum, but one of them is about the degree to which we challenge other people's thinkings, or challenge the status quo, or challenge the rules and regulations, and how much we prefer to sort of accept that other people have a voice and other people in the room may have a better idea than us, and therefore we sort of acquiesce. We're happy for other people to have their views promoted. And at a sort of academic level, that all sounds quite easy. But when you actually say to someone, well, you know, have you noticed that over the last 3 hours with the work we've been doing, you're tending to challenge everything all the time? You know, it doesn't matter whether, shall we have a coffee break? Shall we open the windows? Is it too cold in here? You know, you're expressing a viewpoint that's often contrary to everyone else. And they say, yes, that's me. And you say, well, have you stopped to think about how others might feel about you doing that all the time? Or if you find, it's quite often I find someone who's saying, you know, I've noticed when you're working with your colleagues, you tend to just let other people take the floor, and it's nothing to do with extroversion or introversion. You're just someone who naturally likes other people to express their opinions, and genuinely, if you feel their views are more considered or based on more experience, you just let it happen. Do you ever get to a point where you feel frustrated and say, oh yeah, all the time? You know, I get fed up sometimes with feeling steamrolled into making a decision when actually I don't agree with it. And so having the point you make, Phil, having that conversation around, well, when that's happening, how do you feel? And if you feel frustrated, can you do something about it? What might you do differently? Your point, Phil, about, you know, I've got used to counting people, but I do it automatically. I don't count the gravestones. You know, how do you just attune yourself to say, actually, here's a point where maybe I will say something, or I will step in and say I disagree. And if you're challenging all the time, have you, you know, what's it like? Have you asked someone else who you work closely with what it's like to be challenged all the time? And that's where all of this seems to be so powerful, that those conversations that people then have, that reflection on the impact on others. I mean, I thought it was quite interesting. I don't know whether you saw it in the news this morning, but Her Majesty the Queen has been on Zoom or YouTube or whatever yesterday, talking about the vaccination and saying, you know, it's not just about looking after yourself, but actually being vaccinated is helping someone else. You know, this reflection that there's two people in this vaccination scheme at the moment, and often getting people to understand that there are two people in the relationship thing. There are more than two people in the workplace is a really interesting and fruitful conversation to have, in my experience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the conversation is helped by being able to open up somebody's knowledge or awareness of not just their self-awareness, but of the alternatives, which some people would tend to say this is the right behavior and this is the wrong behavior. Although that in itself is a kind of a personality thing of being judgmental or not. So, but we can, with a lot of that, start the conversation and lead people towards consideration of the alternative. Now, I think one of the challenges then is what to do with that. A lot of these questionnaires, personality tests will be on a dimension where there are two opposites. Introversion, extroversion, confident, cautious, organized, disorganized. Flexible, inflexible, that should be. You see, there's judgment in the words that we use within them already. And then they go down to a bit of a mechanical metaphor of a gap analysis that you have to fill by practicing the opposite behaviors, which I think is different to the consideration that other people might do things differently and you might need to accommodate that. And so we quite often just treat it as an individual bit of work to be done, as opposed to a team bit of work to be done.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's because lots of companies still reward individual performance. So there is a tendency in certain companies to underline the fact that it is up to you to do the best you can. And of course, you have to be a team worker as well, but ultimately you are appraised on your own, as it were. And that's not always conducive to realizing that the more you work with others and understand them and they understand you, that actually you can benefit your own performance, but also the performance of somebody else. And to briefly jump back to the preference for details, I learned very quickly to work with a boss that I had years and years ago, who was even less into details than I am. I'm not particularly into details unless I have to, in which case it becomes a bit too much sometimes. But he was completely big picture, and I just started working for him, and I thought, wrong assumption, I thought, well, he's the boss. He needs, when I have my weekly meeting with him, he needs all the details that I can give him because this is my area of responsibility, so I'd better come prepared. So my first couple of meetings, I bombarded him with data and details, and I quickly found out that it would just put him to sleep. He was a fantastic boss, but very much big picture. And then somebody actually said to me, she said, try just giving him the conclusion and wait for him to ask a few questions and you'll see how much better it goes. So the next week I did that. I left out all the data, all the graphs, all the stuff. And I just went in and I said, it's like this and I think we should be doing that. And he asked me 2 questions, which were a little bit more detailed, but he didn't want to know a lot about it. He was just checking that I knew them, and then he was absolutely fine. And that's how that plays out in the workplace.
Yeah. When I started working on my own, I think it was 1986, I had a telephone account with British Telecom in the UK, and they produced a little booklet called Working for Yourself or something. And I hope I get the guy's name right. There was a psychologist that they'd asked to write this little book about how to deal with people on the telephone when you're self-employed, given that, you're trying to ring people up and win work and provide services. I think his name was David Clark. And the book basically consisted of 4 symbols. There was a square, a circle, a triangle, and a squiggle. And the premise was that when you make the phone call, what image comes into your mind when you hear the person at the other end of the phone talking to you, or when you go and meet them? Is it one of these 4 symbols? And then it went on to say, well, if you think the person is a triangle, this is how perhaps you should approach them. You say a few things, it's very direct, it's high level, and it's all about the decision that needs to be made, focus, clear. If it's a square, this is someone who's like to ask you lots of questions because they're coming at it from 4 different sides and they want to really explore what's going on. And so it went on. It was a little book that I've still got it on my shelf, whatever it is, 30 something years later. And it never ceases to amaze me how it seems to work. Even now when I go into, well, we can't for the moment, but certainly meeting people, these little symbols pop into my mind. I have no idea what the deep psychological study is around it and all the research, but it's a really, really useful little tool to try and help you get on the same wavelength. So, for instance, the squiggle is something where you just chuck ideas at this person and they leap about and they go anywhere and everywhere, and they're not really, to someone who's quite detailed like me, they're not particularly focused. But it's really helpful in just getting you on a different wavelength to the one that I normally approach. I'd love to know more about it. There must be some sort of deep analysis behind it, but it seems to work.
And I think what, Matthew, you've described there is really something that's very, very useful, particularly where you have people who are a bit skeptical about psychometrics instruments. What you were describing there is a kind of creating of a sort of prototype idea about how somebody might be based on some cues, some behaviors, some things they do, some things they say. It's not the same as being stereotypical, which is where you've already got your categories and you're sort of forcing or shoehorning the people into the categories. And that's really, I think, where leaders and team members, whatever we are talking about, can find something really, really helpful, that it's okay to look for patterns and make a sort of working paradigm about that person and how they might best react to you, or how you can get the best reaction out of them, let me put it that way. And that really, again, is a very useful way, I think, of addressing things where people say, I don't want to be psychoanalyzed. What's the scientific basis of this? Which might also reveal something about their personality type. Goes back to challenging, as Matthew said. So that's actually a very good illustration. It can be quite a simple model, because the model is just helping us in how we react, if you describe it like that.
And it is, when I did my psychology degree, this was under the subject called individual differences. And it does very much stress that, because quite often the main contribution filling in one of these questionnaires, or thinking about considering differences, the main contribution it gives a leader is to consider that they're managing or working with people who are not like them. Therefore, they need to not treat them the way they'd like to be treated. And I know we can criticize managers who recruit people like them, but it often comes from a fairly positive approach, which is quite respectful, which is, how should I treat people? I should treat people the way I'd like to be treated. And so that, with that positive intention, you can end up with a team which is comprised of replicas of the leader, because that leader's recruited in their like for people who are similar to them. Sometimes even with the idea that there's a personality type that suits the job. What this does, it quite often, is allow that consideration of people are different to each other, and therefore I need to treat people differently according to what they are like, their individual personality and preferences.
Yeah, and I also like, I mean, there's one, I think we did reference it the other week, but one we all know that I always get into trouble by calling it a simple little sort of assessment, when it probably isn't. But that's the change style indicator, where we look at people's preferences for change. And what I love about that is that, first of all, you state quite openly, this has nothing to do with your ability to manage or lead change. This is nothing about the skills you have, the experience you have. It is just about a natural preference you might have for how you react when change takes place. And I quite like that. And then if you then take people through various workplace scenarios as a result of the result that they've had from their assessment, it just sort of, you can see people saying, this explains quite a bit about why I react as I react, but also why sometimes people around me react in ways that I just don't understand. And now I'm starting to realize why they might react like that. And I always try and get people with that I ask a little story which they follow through. But one of the end questions is, it's all about the favorite room they live in. One of the end questions is that there's a big packing case out in the hall, and all the things that were in this room are now sitting in this packing case. Would you go back into the hall, having had found somebody else had changed everything? Would you go back into the hall and take anything out of the packing case? And what happens is you get a range of answers from, I might have a look, but probably no, to, I would spend an awful lot of time in the hall pulling everything out of the box and checking it and deciding on what I was going to keep, right down to, you know, the wedding photograph of my mother-in-law and my father-in-law. You know, that's so crucial to me. And as you do it, people can see themselves doing exactly that for themselves in an environment where change has taken place. And I'm looking at Brit because she's about to move back to Holland. Change taking place in her life, but you know, it's all the sort of just the opening up of a possibility, which is, I find, so important, so useful.
Yeah, and it's also, when do you start filling the boxes, which takes us to another sort of dimension where I'm very much a sort of last minute person. And my dear and long-suffering husband is the other extreme. So he would have liked to have had the boxes in like 3 months ago. And I'm still sort of dithering, keeping things open, because I'm not quite sure what I would like to sort, what I would like to clean, what I would like to give away. It drives him mad. And I'm driven mad by all these boxes that would have had to have been filled 2 weeks ago. Or I think, but we're only moving next week, you know, like, come on. another dimension which doesn't always play up in a nice way, and sometimes in a very funny way. And it also is not, of course, limited to the personal life, but it also plays up in the workplace, whereby, you know, some people, when they have a project, they will milestone it to death, which, I mean, again, that's, sorry, I shouldn't make jokes about that, because, you know, here's the judgmental language coming in. Whereas other people are fine to leave the project sort of vaguely defined until the very last minute, and then they get their act together. And the thing is that both types of people can produce an excellent result. It's just the way in which they got there is very, very different. And unless they've talked about that and sorted it out between themselves, it can be a huge amount of, again, a source of misunderstanding.
Yeah, and even at the level of a meeting agenda, you've got 5 points on a meeting agenda. Someone says, "Oh, can we just go back to point 1?" And you can sense from perhaps someone else the discomfort, the anger, the frustration coming out. Maybe that's my own judgmental language, sort of a little bit more subtly coming out as well. But it can be, you know, very much at a day-to-day level. It doesn't have to be a huge project that you're working on necessarily. It can just be these regular interactions where these play out. And a little bit more awareness, as we've been describing, also helps us be a bit more tolerant within ourselves. It's better for our own resilience, our own mental and perhaps even physical health longer term. So, yeah.
And if you've got two people who are different to each other, the flexible one and the planful one, you've got all the bases covered. And so if they can work together, then that's an ideal approach that kind of accommodates all circumstances. And the bit you're working out with those conversations, Tim, is how can they get on when they may be judgmental of each other's approaches? Because, of course, the way I do things is, in my judgment, the best way to do them.
Well, with the meeting, sorry, Phil, with the meeting agenda example, one of the best solutions I ever heard was to have, say, 5 points, like I just said, and after every other point, have any other business. So 1, any other business; 2, any other business; 3, any other business. It's trying to bring in the slightly more, let's say, spontaneous approach with the very, very process-oriented approach. But it can work because you've had the discussion to create that.
Which brings me on to the important point of what do you do with this? So you complete a test, it gives you a nice report, which is a good description, which you recognize, hopefully, of yourself. And then what do you do with it? And we've sort of established here that the conversation is important, that it's talking with people about that and helping them understand it or articulate it or reflect on it. And then I think quite often a lot of people will be saying, so what do I do with this? And now we can carry on with the mechanical metaphor of there's a gap, fill the gap with some behaviors. But Tim, what you're pointing out is practical ways in which you can do that, because we will automatically tend to operate the way we've always operated. So in habit, and forming new habits is a big challenge. So the more practical you can be with those sorts of ways of engineering the way to work out of your preference sounds important as well.
And I think it's partly a preference of mine, but you can do an awful lot with humor when you have a good relationship with colleagues and co-workers. You know, I mean, I could say to Brit, you've got your boxes open again, they're never going to get closed, are they? But of course, there are certain situations that's exactly what we need to do, where we can't close things down too early, because the nature of the problem requires that we are trying things out, that we're not finding a solution instantly because such a solution might not exist. So I think you can do an awful lot with humor, what we call banter, knocking ideas back and forth. I'm expressing a preference of my own there, obviously, when I say it, because that's the way that I would interact with people, but it can work, definitely.
And I think it's also I'm finding it at the moment. I'm working on a number of things where I'm working with people that I don't know quite so well. And I'm finding it quite enlightening, just giving up stuff, you know, just sort of biting your lip. And if you feel you would normally interject or say something or try and be a bit more controlling in you know, I'd like it done this way. and the freedom that comes from saying to someone, yeah, great idea, let's do that, let's try it, and you're thinking, I haven't got a clue what they're talking about, but they seem to know what they're talking about and they've experienced, so let's get on with it. And how sometimes you then end up, as I found just in the last couple of weeks, either being really quite pleasantly surprised how something works, when probably your natural instinct would be to say, this is not what I would do. And then sometimes when it doesn't work, not how critical you then become, but actually how sort of you step back and say, yeah, but I've learned something, that it works there, but it doesn't work here. So that in itself is an advantage rather than what I might have done before. But it's having that slightly sort of courageous moment to say, this is not about you, this is about other people. And let's see what happens when you give other people some choices to make. And I found it quite enlightening. It sounds awful at my age, but I found it quite enlightening that, what I thought wasn't going to work has worked. And it's been nothing to do with me, which is great. And someone else has got the kudos, and the client in this case has been delighted. And I thought, yeah, great, move on, But it is taking that practical step, Phil, the point you make. It is having the nerve to go against what you might normally have done and be prepared to see where it takes you.
You're on mute, Phil. Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Tim. You pointed, Matthew, to a lot of advantages that you gained from that to be able to say, okay, I did something different and it was a benefit to me, and that will work in the future, in theory, the other way around, which is you do that not automatic approach in order to get the advantages you had last time.
Yeah. And then that encourages you to make some further alterations to the way you might normally react to something and see where that takes you. And sometimes it might be painful and sometimes it might be really quite pleasant, but you don't know that until you've tried it.
So what we're talking about here as well is this practical approach to this in a conversation from the results. And I think that challenges the idea that we are just reading the report. It gives us our results and we can go away and practice the other thing. I think it takes some effort, some practice and some motivation to be able to do that. Yeah,
absolutely. So I'm conscious of time, anything else we want to share in this conversation? Any other thoughts that come to mind?
Well, did you talk about doing an instrument as a team or as a working group last time? I'm not sure I recall that, but where it's a more collective effort, where you get collective feedback.
I don't think we touched on that. No. So, Tim, what triggers that? What thought has been triggered by that comment?
But we've been talking about individual leadership. We've been talking about how, as an individual leader, I may be quite humble and open my mind up to other ways of doing things. We talked about, as I say, adjusting our behaviors, but based on knowing who we are. And I'm also thinking about, if the springboard here is talking about psychometrics, it's talking about instruments where people fill in and self-rate, perhaps the next conversation, because this is really a much longer conversation, can be how we would use that within a team, because there's lots of instruments available for teams as well. Of course, with the same caveat, it's a springboard for a discussion rather than putting people in certain pigeonholes or groupings. It's a basis for a discussion where we work together. So we perhaps take a more collective lens than just the individual lens that we've largely focused on here. That's what I was thinking. But that's a whole other 40 minutes, I would say.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Good idea.
Yeah.
I sense another conversation being put into the diary.
Psychometric.
Yeah. Great. Well, it's been super having this chat. And Phil and Tim, thanks for joining us at
pleasure.
Short notice. And what we'll do is I'll get in touch, and Brit and I'll book another date when we continue this conversation. But picking up on Tim's point, perhaps looking at the sort of team aspect of this and seeing where that takes us. And just to finish off, to say that, if anyone's been watching this and has got questions, then do just get in touch and we'll do our best to try and sort of reflect on them. Or if you think what we've been talking about is a load of absolute, rubbish, nonsense. I know we did have one response to our conversation a couple of weeks ago, where someone was quite rightly making a comment about their perspectives on Jung and the use of Myers-Briggs. Then do feel free. This is not a closed shop. So if you've got some interesting suggestions, thoughts, challenges, then let us know about them, and we'll try and do our best to respond. But
or if you join us on a live
stream. Yeah, get in. We've got this live streaming now. You just join the conversation and say, "Rubbish, I disagree with you because," and let's get on with it.
Yeah.
Good.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for asking.
Thank you. See you.